Good evening and welcome to the New York Society Library, the oldest cultural institution in the city. In fact, we're celebrating our 270th birthday this year. And we are very happy to be welcoming Jack Kelly to speak about his recent book, God Save Benedict Arnold. Our library members included both revolutionaries and loyalists during the Revolutionary War, and you can check out what they were reading on our charging ledger, which is on our website. Jack Kelly has received rave reviews for his wonderful new book, and Matthew Pearls of the New York Times called it a fascinating page-turner. Mr. Kelly is a journalist, novelist, and historian whose books include Band of Giants, which received the DAR History Award Medal. His writing has appeared in many periodicals, including the Wall Street Journal. He is a fellow of the New York Foundation for the Arts and has appeared in the History Channel and NPR and many other places. And now, let us welcome Jack Kelly.
Thank you, Jeanette and Sarah and everyone here at the library. Thank you all for coming this evening. I wrote this book, God Save Benedict Arnold, mostly because it's a very good story. And the story of Benedict Arnold is one of the most interesting stories of the Revolutionary era, and I think of American history in general. Everybody knows Benedict Arnold, and everybody that knows him knows one thing about him. And I don't even have to say what that is, because you know what it is. So I wrote the book in part to get across the idea that there's much more to Benedict Arnold than that one thing, and that it's important to understand Arnold in order to get a really clear picture of the Revolutionary War. And I found as I was writing the book that it's also a very good way of getting into the Revolutionary War. We're coming up to the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, and Benedict Arnold was so involved in the early years of the Revolution and all the major operations that if you follow his career, you see, you get a good picture of those first crucial 3 years of the Revolution. So I'm going to try to get the technical thing that's going here. This is don't seem to be. Oops. So the Revolutionary War began on the morning of April 19th, 1775, when Redcoats shot and killed 8 Minutemen at Lexington Green, and the Patriot forces in retaliation killed more than 70 of the king's soldiers, and the war was on. Benedict Arnold marched off to war the day after the news arrived in New Haven, where he lived. He gave up his business. He immediately marched off to war. 3 weeks after the violence at Lexington, Benedict Arnold captured one of the most, I guess I'm not going to be able to use this. I'll just point to you. And you can, one of the most important fortifications in the 13 colonies at Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain in upper New York. He not only captured the fort, but he then, on his own initiative, without orders from anyone, went up into Canada and captured a warship that was the only British warship on Lake Champlain, and thereby secured all of Lake Champlain for the Patriots. In addition to that, the significance of that achievement, let's see, okay. The reason that was a significant achievement was that the British had the idea, for the first 2 years of the war, the strategic objective was to capture the waterway that went from Montreal down Lake Champlain, Lake George, a portage over to the Hudson River, and then all the way down to New York City. That was kind of the superhighway of that era, and they were planning to send an army over to Canada and then invade from the north. The obstacle to that, of course, was Fort Ticonderoga right in the middle that blocked their access to it, and also the fact that Arnold had gained control of Lake Champlain. In addition to that, there were a lot of excess cannon at Fort Ticonderoga, which the following winter the Patriots put on sleds, dragged all the way across the state of Massachusetts, and George Washington used those cannon to get his first victory by driving the British out of Boston. So those two things were attributable to Benedict Arnold, and the question is, what do they say in the history books about it? It's barely a footnote. You rarely read about how important the capture of Ticonderoga was. And when the credit is given, it's often given to this next slide of Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys did provide the manpower for the takeover of Ticonderoga. And but after the excitement was over, the Green Mountain Boys, who were a vigilante group that Allen had gotten up before the war that really had nothing to do with the dispute with Britain, they just went home after the capture of Ticonderoga. And Ethan Allen himself, if you look at his overall participation in the Revolutionary War, I don't know, I don't think I would have named a furniture company after him, but he's very popular in Vermont. But the idea for the next slide of the idea of taking over Ticonderoga, the leadership of the operation, and most importantly, the initiative to take control of Lake Champlain were all Benedict Arnold. So the next question is, do we owe it to Benedict Arnold to get the history right? And I don't think we do, because Benedict Arnold was a traitor, and there's nothing in my book that in any way exonerates his treason. In fact, I think his treason was in many ways more serious than many people think. So we don't owe it to Arnold, but we owe it to ourselves to get the history right. And the problem is that Arnold is a paradox. He's both a hero and a villain. He's both someone who is devoted to the Patriot cause and tried to destroy the revolution later. And that's a difficult idea to get your mind around, and people have tried to avoid that paradox over the years by saying he was not a hero at all. He was simply a villain in disguise. He was always a traitor. His accomplishments were insignificant, really. His participation in various events was minimal. His motives were suspect. And some of the early biographies even said he was a nasty little boy, and therefore he must have been a traitor from the cradle. That's the kind of Parson Weems history, where everything is simple. George Washington never told a lie. Benedict Arnold is a villain. But the real history, what I would call sort of history for adults, looks at the conflicts, the complexity of history and the complexity of people. Because even our history is full of people who are paradoxical. And even just in the Revolutionary War, you have people like Aaron Burr or Ethan Allen himself, General Charles Lee, even Horatio Gates, who wavered, who had their self-interest involved, who had changes of heart. None of them went as far as Benedict Arnold, but Arnold really is the epitome of that paradoxical and complex figure that gives us some insight into human nature, because these people are dangerous. They can be dangerous, and Benedict Arnold certainly turned out to be dangerous. So we go on to 1776. This is a replica that was created by the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum of one of the gunboats on Lake Champlain. And the value of taking over Fort Ticonderoga is now proven because the British start the invasion that I was talking about earlier, sent a 7,000-man army to Canada, but they can't bring that army down to attack Ticonderoga because the Patriots have control of Lake Champlain with gunboats and other warships like this, and the British don't have them. So if they brought the army down on transports, they would all have been vulnerable to American warships. So they had to build their own fleet of armed ships. So that began then a arms race with what you see down here of Skeensboro was the very southern tip of Lake Champlain, now called Whitehall, where Benedict Arnold was building more ships to build up the American fleet. And the British were up in St. John's in Canada building their own fleet of warships with all the resources of the Royal Navy. And it went on all summer, this arms race of who's going to build the most ships the quickest. In August, Benedict Arnold took his fleet all the way up to the very top of where you see the state line, or the international boundary, really, going across there at the top, the north end of Lake Champlain, a small fleet of warships, what they managed to put together. And he waited for the British, and he waited a long time. All through September, the British continued to build warships, bigger and bigger ships, more and more cannon. They wanted to have overwhelming firepower before they came down the lake. And Benedict Arnold finally drew his fleet back to Valcour Island, which is sort of halfway down Lake Champlain. And he put it in there, it was protected, and it was, there was a lot of storms on Lake Champlain in the fall. So he wanted the boats to be protected and sort of hidden from the British, and waited even longer. And it wasn't until October 11th that the British finally felt that they had the overwhelming firepower that they wanted, and they came down Lake Champlain, and they fought in the next, this was the a contemporary map of Valcour Island. It's about a mile off of the New York shore. Benedict Arnold, second in command, said, "We've got to get out of here. This is going to be suicidal if we stay here." The whole massive Royal Navy, very skilled sailors coming down against what were basically amateurs. A lot of these guys that were in the fleet, that were managing the boats, were soldiers that they'd taken out of the ranks, and they weren't even sailors, not necessarily even been on a boat before. So Arnold said, "No, we're not going to run. We're going to stay here and fight, and I have a plan." He always seemed to have a plan. He's a very strategic thinker. And his plan was that the line at the top there was the American line, and all those boats were anchored there. So they didn't have to sail and shoot at the same time, and they just had the cannons pointed out. There was no entry from the north end of the sort of what looks like a strait there, but it's really a bay because there was shallow water up at the north. So the British had to come around from the south. This line here represents the British gunboats, which were maneuverable by oars, but the sailing ships of the British, which they'd spent so much time building, were not able to get up into the bay because it was too narrow and the wind was against them. And they were sailing ships. They fought for 7 hours, point blank cannon range, very brutal form of warfare, very bloody, shooting back and forth. It got dark, and the Americans were still standing, and the British had not been able to break through that line. But they'd expended 3/4 of their ammunition. Many of their boats were damaged, so now what? Benedict Arnold said, "I have a plan. We're going to escape." And the way that they escaped from Valcour Island was almost like a fairy tale. In the dead of night, very quietly, while the British were going about repairing some of their ships and making noise, they slipped through the blockade that the British had set up at the south end and got farther down the lake. There was more fighting farther down the lake. Most of the American fleet was destroyed, but the outcome was that by the time the British got their army down to Fort Ticonderoga, it was already getting into November, and they felt it was too late. They were afraid that the lake would freeze, which it does freeze in the winter, and back in those days it definitely did. And if it froze, they would be trapped down there, so they decided they would go back to Montreal and try again in the spring. So the campaign in the North in 1776 was a complete success in the sense that they had stopped that invasion. And it was an accomplishment of Benedict Arnold mostly. Was that a significant achievement? Well, if we look at the next map, it's a little bit complicated map, but it's depicting George Washington's failure at the other end of that water corridor in New York City. He had first lost the largest battle of the entire war, in the Battle of Brooklyn, in August. In September, he was pushed out of New York City, eventually fought in White Plains and lost, crossed over to the other side of the Hudson River, and was pushed all the way down across New Jersey until he found himself in Pennsylvania in December. His 20,000-man army had shrunk to 3,000 men, and he wrote a letter to his brother at that time, and he said, "I think the game is pretty near up." If he had also had to contend with an invasion coming down the Hudson River from Canada, I think it would have been curtains for him. But instead, Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, who had been the commander at Fort Ticonderoga, came down from the north with more than 600 men to reinforce Washington and joined him out in Pennsylvania. And that perhaps gave Washington the impetus, or the confidence, let's say, to cross the Delaware. And if we go to the next slide, some of the men who fought at Valcour Island actually crossed the Delaware River with Washington on Christmas night, fought at Trenton, and gave Washington what was probably his most spectacular victory. Really turned around the Patriot fortunes. Benedict Arnold was not among them because he had been sent off on another assignment. But as far as the importance of all the fighting in the North and the way that it helped Washington have this victory in the South was attributable largely to Benedict Arnold. So what do they say about this in the history books? I can't say that it's just a footnote, because a few years ago there was a book that came out called Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty, which is on the next slide, which I wrote myself. And it was a pretty good book. I recommend it. But when I was researching that book, I was surprised at how little had been written about this campaign. I was like, why don't we hear about this? And it was because Benedict Arnold. David McCullough, who I have an enormous respect for, one of our greatest historians, wrote a book called 1776. And it was about the war in that one year. And he didn't slight the campaign in the North. He just didn't mention it whatsoever. There's not a single mention in that book of Benedict Arnold or the whole campaign in the North. And it was because he didn't want his story tainted, the great story of Washington's redemption sort of, tainted by Benedict Arnold, the traitor. And that's been the problem over the years of how Benedict Arnold's paradoxical character has distorted history. So we move on to 1777, and this was Benedict Arnold's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He had one of the biggest houses in town, very successful business there as an international trader, sea captain, He ran an apothecary store, which was really sort of a high-end luxury goods store, which he'd given up in order to fight in the war. And he decided in 1777 to resign his commission with the army. He had felt that he deserved a promotion for his victories at Valcour. He didn't get it. George Washington wanted him to have it too, but then, as now, Congress controlled the high-level promotions in the Army, and they didn't give it to Benedict Arnold. It was kind of a lot of just murky politics involved. And even worse was that they took junior officers and promoted them over Arnold's head, which was a slap in the face to any officer to have your subordinates now suddenly ordering you around. So he got fed up, and he was a very prickly character to begin with, and he decided to resign his commission. He wrote out his resignation. He went down to Philadelphia to turn it into Congress. And by coincidence, the day that he arrived to turn in or actually did turn in his resignation, news arrived at the Philadelphia, as on the next slide, that Fort Ticonderoga had fallen, finally. And General John Burgoyne had pulled off the invasion that I've been talking about, 7,000-man army, because the American fleet had largely been eradicated from Lake Champlain. He was able to take Ticonderoga quite easily, and he was now on the march towards Albany. Benedict Arnold forgot about his resignation, jumped on a horse, rode as fast as he could up to join General Gates, who was now in command in the north, and together they decided to meet General Burgoyne's forces on the high ground beside the Hudson River, a few miles south of the village of Saratoga, which you see there marked as Bemis Heights. The village of Saratoga is now called Schuylerville, but they were sort of up in the hills overlooking the river. They fought two battles there, collectively known as the Battle of Saratoga. And in both battles, General Burgoyne tried to sweep around the left side of the American lines, and in both battles, Benedict Arnold was in charge of the left division of the American forces. In the first battle, he fought Burgoyne to a standstill, inflicted pretty heavy casualties, and in the second battle, he decisively defeated Burgoyne, and then personally led a charge, and the next slide, into the British field fortifications, broke through and put Burgoyne in a position where he had to do what he had said he would never do, which was to retreat. This depicts Arnold on the horse there. While riding into the fortifications on his horse, he was shot in the leg, severely wounded, but General Burgoyne, 10 days later, had to surrender his entire army to General Gates. So was this a significant event? It's referred to as the turning point of the Revolutionary War. It certainly was a turning point. It brought the French in. It really changed the complexion of the war. Time magazine judged that the Battle of Saratoga was the single most important battle fought anywhere in the world in the last 1,000 years. So it sounds pretty important anyway. And what do they say in the history books? Well, they can't say it wasn't important. So over the years, there have been many stories about how Arnold did not participate in this battle. He was either depicted as being drunk during the battle, he was sulking in his cabin, he'd been relieved of his command, he never went out in the battlefield. Well, they can't say never because he was wounded on the battlefield. So they say he was riding around out there like a crazy man. These were the stories to bring down Benedict Arnold's reputation that came out after he proved to be a traitor. That is now changing, and many historians today recognize that Benedict Arnold really was the crucial commander of one of the most important battles of the war, and really was the fighting man who won that battle. 3 years later, on the next slide, we see the one thing that everybody knows about Benedict Arnold. He went over to the British. This was an effigy that was dragged through Philadelphia that showed him not only two-faced, but holding a mask, the devil behind him. He's on his way to the gallows, if they ever got there. The question, of course, everybody asks is, why did he do it? And there have been many reasons given. A lot of historians have their favorite theories. Some say it was the money. British did pay him a substantial amount of money to hand over the fort at West Point to the British and to come over to their side. Some said it was his wife's doing, that he had married Peggy Shippen, who was a young loyalist, young woman from Philadelphia, a loyalist leaning at least, and that she influenced him. Some said he didn't like the French alliance. He'd been brought up hating the French. Some said that he didn't like the idea of independence. That was going too far. Some said it was just the promotions and the dispute he had with Congress. My own answer to that question is, I don't know. I don't know why he went over. None of those reasons to me are convincing enough to push him into that 180-degree turnaround. And I think that Benedict Arnold was an enigmatic character, and I sometimes wonder if even he could have articulated himself why he did it, but he did do it. I discuss it in the book, some of the factors that went into it, and I think we have to think about things like post-traumatic stress disorder. He certainly went through a lot of trauma. His leg wound was extremely serious. It would have been amputated. He didn't allow them to amputate it, but he was certainly in pain for a long time, laid up for a long time. The fact that he was a narcissist, I think that was pretty much demonstrated. He always wanted to be at the center of things, and once he was knocked out of the Army, or being active in the Army, and had all this time to think, he might have just tried to bring himself back into the center by ending the war by going over to the British, the way he saw it. He didn't see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as somebody had wisely decided that the war had gone far enough and now was time to end it. I wouldn't give those speculations as reasons why he did it, but I think factors to consider. He never did anything by halves, so on the next slide we see he got control of the lower Hudson Valley, and you can see up near the top there is West Point. It was not a military academy then. It was a very important fort protecting the Hudson River. And he decided to allow the British to take over West Point, which they had wanted to do during the entire war. The story of how Arnold's plot unfolded, as I say, Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays about history, but sometimes history creates its own dramas. And this I think, was one of them. It's one of the more dramatic moments in American history. In September of 1780, he met with Major John Andre, who was the head of British intelligence, on the west side of the Hudson River in Haverstraw, which you can see there. It's up by Haverstraw Bay. And he gave Andre the details, which you can see a picture of Andre on the next slide, all the details about West Point. He drew a map for him. He told him about the troop deployments, everything ready for the British to take it over. Arnold then went home to his headquarters, which was on the east side of the Hudson River near West Point. And Major Andre, after some delay, started riding by horseback in civilian clothes down the Hudson River, also on the east side. He crossed over in the ferry. You can see on the next slide, I think. He went over up there by Peekskill and was riding down the Hudson River. He was very excited and he was very nervous. And he was excited because he had pulled off the biggest intelligence coup of the war that was going to make his career and really make his life for him. And he was nervous because that area of Westchester County was no man's land. And it was above the British lines, were closer to New York, and below the American lines up by Peekskill. So it was patrolled by both loyalist and patriot militiamen. And Major Andre is riding along, and sure enough, 3 guys jump out of the bushes, stop him, and he then made a big mistake, and he said, "I hope you're of our party." And one of the militiamen, who was probably smarter than he looked, said, "Oh yeah, what party is that?" So now Major Andre had to guess. And he said, the lower party, meaning the British down in New York. And the guy said, "We're Americans, get down." And they searched him. We'll see in the next slide, artists' imagining of it happening. Found these documents and maps that he had hidden in his boot. He offered them bribes. They refused. They took him to their commanding officer, Colonel Jameson. And Colonel Jameson was a little slow on the uptake, I think, because his first impulse was to send a message to his commanding officer, Benedict Arnold. But after the courier took off with this letter, he started thinking, he's looking at the documents like, this is all Benedict Arnold's handwriting. This is, something, he couldn't quite figure it out, but it's something very suspicious going on. He said, "I think I better send a message to Washington and with these documents." So then comes the plot twist. On the next thing, we see George Washington. George Washington was not in the American camp, which was over on the New Jersey border. He had gone out to Hartford, Connecticut to meet with French officers and was on his way back and was scheduled to have breakfast with Benedict Arnold the next morning. And then they were going to go over to West Point and inspect the fort. So you have the tense situation where 2 separate couriers are both on their way to Arnold's headquarters, which the second courier found that's where he realized that's where he could find George Washington to give him the message. Washington is coming down from the north, riding along the river with his entourage and a whole pack of guards that he traveled with. Some of Washington's aides arrive at Arnold's headquarters, and they say, the general's right up the road. He'll be here in a few minutes. Get ready. At that moment, the first courier arrives, hands a letter to Benedict Arnold. He reads it. He says to his wife, "I got to go." And he tells everybody else, "I'm going over to West Point. Tell Washington to wait." He runs down to the boat launch on the Hudson River, jumps in a boat, tells the crew, "Row as fast as you can southward." Washington arrives. Arnold's not there. Where is he? He's over at West Point. "Okay, we'll go over and do the inspection now," Washington thinks. He takes the whole entourage over to West Point. They get there. They haven't seen Benedict Arnold in 2 days. So that's kind of weird. Washington starts looking around, and the fortifications are falling down. There's not enough men here. They don't seem to be ready for any. And he said later, he described his own thinking at that moment. He said, "My mind misgave me, but I had not the least idea of the real cause." And I think we can all identify with that. It's like there's something wrong here, but what is it? You know, I can't quite put my finger on it, because he couldn't in his imagination imagine what the real cause was. So being George Washington, the unflappable, he went back to Arnold's headquarters and decided to take a nap. And before he lay down in bed, the second courier arrives, handed him the letter, handed him the papers. He immediately saw through what was happening. He called in Henry Knox, who was his most trusted subordinate, and he said, "Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust now?" It was not a rhetorical question, because at that moment, Washington didn't know how far this plot went, who was involved. All he knew was that Benedict Arnold, the person he had trusted the most, or among the people he trusted the most, had gone over to the British. He sent Alexander Hamilton riding by horseback down the Hudson River to try to catch up with Arnold. He sent a message over to the army over on the New Jersey border to get as many troops as they could marching up towards West Point to prevent the British plot. And then the real drama started on the next slide. Peggy Shippen, now Peggy Arnold, and this is coincidentally, this was a drawing of Peggy Shippen drawn by Major Andre when the British were in control of Philadelphia, and she was flirting with the British officers with their hairdo. I think he depicted the hairdo pretty well. And she started tearing her clothes off, very unusual in those days, and screaming that Washington, she had to see Washington, and they were going to kill her baby, and all the officers tried to comfort her, not suspecting that she, I think they didn't think a woman could be so devious, to be in on the plot from the beginning, and was trying to help her husband escape. And then in the next slide we see he did escape, and he got down to a British ship, went to New York, was made a brigadier general in the British Army, led British troops against Americans in Virginia, and then finally raided and burned his hometown up in New London, Connecticut, before going over to England, and he never set foot in America again. The three militiamen who captured Major Andre, I have to finish up the story of Major Andre on the next slide. This was a portrait that he drew of himself waiting for his trial, which happened within a week of the discovery, and then he was hanged as a spy. And the three militiamen who had captured him, if we go to the next slide, they received these medals. They were actually quite famous for a while. They received the silver medals with the word fidelity as a kind of contrast to Benedict Arnold's lack of fidelity. These were the first military decorations ever awarded in American history, and they were given to those men for refusing the bribes and turning in Arnold's, foiling Arnold's plot. So a few days after the plot was uncovered, one of his aides said, wouldn't it have been better if the bullet that went through his leg at Saratoga had gone through his heart? The people who knew him, his friends, were so disappointed in him. And historians have really repeated a version of that down the years, that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would be remembered as one of our greatest military heroes. And I think from just the few accomplishments, which are not all of Arnold's accomplishments that I've talked about here this evening, you can see the logic of that idea. But I don't think it was true. I think that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would have been forgotten, as so many of the heroes of the Revolution, and Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan and John Sullivan and you ask people, I live up in the Hudson Valley. We have Greene County, Putnam County, Sullivan County, Montgomery County, and you ask people and they're not quite sure who these people were even. All the great heroes of the Revolution. I think Arnold would have been in that category. So I'm hopeful that as we approach this 250th anniversary, that maybe the men who did the fighting in the Revolution can receive some new notice. I mean, we're going to remember Benedict Arnold, but what about all the others, and particularly the men who fought in the ranks, you know, to create a country, not just fighting for their country, they were fighting to create a country. And if you read the letters and diaries of those days, they often spoke about that they felt that they were fighting for the freedom of generations unborn. They used that phrase. And we are those generations, and they were fighting for us. So thank you very much, and you can go to the next slide. It has my website if you want to sign up for a newsletter. Everything is on the website. And thank you all for listening this evening, and I'm happy to answer some questions. Yeah.
He had, I think, lots of children. Did they all leave the country with him?
Yeah, he had 3 sons by his first wife, who both his wives were named Peggy, which makes it kind of confusing. And then he had 5 children by the second Peggy in England mostly. They had the 1 son when they went over there. All of them became officers in the British Army. That was part of the sort of payoff for Peggy got a stipend for her part in the plot. He got not as much money as they talked about because he wasn't able to hand over West Point, but he got a fairly substantial amount of money. And his sons, even when they were teenagers, they were officers in the British Army, and they got half pay for whatever rank they were at, which was a pretty good, amount of money to let them live comfortably. His descendants actually were in the British Army for generations, down to World War I. And some of them were generals, and so the family did continue over in England, and he himself wanted to get back into active military service. That was his real goal, and he was so hated by the British officer corps. First, because he was a traitor, and secondly, because he'd killed so many British soldiers. So they didn't want him. Once he served briefly in America, he was just left out of the military altogether. And he tried to get back in, and never was able to. Yeah.
Was there a plot to kill Washington at that breakfast?
It's a little murky as to whether part of the plot was that they were going to capture Washington, because it was really the timing. It was so unpredictable. When it didn't seem likely that Major Andre could get down to New York, give these plans over, and get all their troops in motion in time to catch Washington at West Point. And Washington himself didn't think that part of Arnold's plot was to capture Washington. He thought that was just, he said he wouldn't have done that. It made it too complicated. It was possible that if they moved quickly, they could have captured Washington. So, yeah.
I guess was he ever intimate with Washington, or close, like I would say, the Hamilton? Yeah. He
didn't. Yeah, that's a good question. He and Washington were very. Washington really loved Arnold and thought of him as one of his really important subordinates. They didn't have a close relationship because Arnold was almost always off on his own, doing his own operations separate from Washington. In 75, he went up to the invasion of Canada. In 75, he fought, as I described, at Malcour. And in 77, he and Gates were fighting at Saratoga. Washington was down fighting in Philadelphia. So they were never that close in just interactions, but they kept in touch. And George Washington was really heartbroken by the
Are there Arnold
Yeah.
diaries and memoirs and letters?
he was one of the things about Arnold that makes it hard for historians, I would say, is he was not an intellectual in any sense. He didn't write letters. He didn't leave behind much in the way of writings at all. So there's a few scraps. There's some letters that he sent to his first wife that survived. He saved a lot of letters from his mother that he got when he was in school. And his mother, he was very close to his mother. She was a Calvinist, of a very severe type of Calvinist. And every time she wrote to him as a young teenager, she'd say, "Remember, you're going to die. Keep that in mind at all times." And I think he wasn't religious himself, but I think that did sink in with him, and it probably served him well as a military officer. So. Yeah.
Can you say anything about his actions up in Montreal or Quebec, trying to capture the Quebec?
Yeah, I go into quite a bit of detail in the book about the famous march to Quebec. Was partly Arnold's idea, was partly George Washington's idea. They were sending a force up through Lake Champlain, having captured Ticonderoga. They could now invade Canada themselves before the British sent over reinforcements. So they decided to do that. They sent Richard Montgomery to lead that army up the main force. But they thought, well, Washington always liked complicated military strategies, first, especially early in the war. How about if we send another army up through Maine, marching over the mountains of Maine? And he's assigned Arnold and 1,000 men to walk over a mountain trail, which was not, there was no roads. Even the trail was hardly mapped. And they got up there. It was late in the season. It got very cold. They ran out of food. They were marching along, and men had not eaten for 2 or 3 days, still marching to try to get to Quebec. And it was a great illustration of Arnold's leadership. I mean, it wasn't a battle, but it was a very stressful situation up there that he had 1,000 men's lives depended on him. They were too far, they'd gone too far to get back to where they'd started in Maine, and they didn't know what was up ahead. So they had to make it, Arnold had to make a decision. He decided to leave the army, rush down into Canada, get enough food to send back to them, which he was able to do. And the Canadians were actually quite receptive to them, but in terms of providing food, but not in terms of fighting. They thought that they'd all join in. So the whole campaign in Canada turned out to be a debacle, but Arnold's participation was quite a remarkable feat. Yeah.
We've got a comment here in the live chat that might lead to a further comment. A participant says, I picked up the brochure for the Battles of Saratoga 250, I assume the 250th anniversary of the Battles of Saratoga, today at the Saratoga Springs Library. With your book fresh in mind, I noted that only Gates is mentioned in the very brief summary paragraph. So again, they're suppressing Arnold's presence, I assume, and talking only about Gates.
It still goes on.
Yeah.
It still goes on. And, I suppose you could say it's a matter of opinion, but I think that I know the people at the battlefield itself, and that's the Saratoga battlefield is really, I think, the most evocative of all Revolutionary War sites. And it was preserved as a farm. It wasn't until much later it became a national park, but it was never built over. They've kept it very much in the same terrain as when battle was fought there. And they are very, of course, interested in doing all the research of how the battle unfolded. And their opinion is that Arnold was the key man. And I think General Gates gets a bad rap myself because his strategy was correct at Saratoga. He allowed Burgoyne to kind of wear himself out and got down. Interestingly, it turned on the question of fodder. And we don't think of that as like, that was the gasoline of that time. And if you didn't have fodder, the army would just grind to a halt. The horses dropped dead, which they were doing. And the longer you stayed in one place, the less fodder there was to, and particularly it was now getting into October when they were fighting that battle. So Burgoyne was weakened before he launched the attack. And his attack, was, particularly the second one, was really much a throw of the dice. But I think that time is coming when Benedict Arnold will be recognized more. I hope that before the 250th. Yeah.
I have two questions after that. I was wondering about what inspired the writer. And I'm also wondering if there are any particular sources that you felt were particularly illuminating during your journey of exploration.
Any particular sources?
Yeah, that were particularly illuminating or set off light bulbs.
Well, I'll explain the title first. I included in the book a kind of historical what if at the end of the book, that one of the things about Benedict Arnold was that and just to go back a step, people often wonder, why was he such a great military strategist and tactician, even though he had no training whatsoever and very little experience in the military? And I think it was because he had been a sea captain. His father had had ships trading down to mostly the West Indies. He had ships from his own business. He would, unlike many merchants, he would go with the ships down to the West Indies. So he was the captain of the ship. And to be a ship's captain in those days, you had to be a very tough character. You had to dominate your crew. You had to pay attention to detail. You had to plan. All these skills, I think, carried over and made him a great military officer. And later, particularly after he was wounded at Saratoga, he asked for a naval command. And for some reason, it never worked out. He never got the naval command. He tried several times. So I have a kind of what if, that if he had gotten a naval command, he could have sailed off instead of being cooped up and recuperating from his wound. He could have been out on a ship. He wouldn't have had to walk around too much. And when he came back, people could have celebrated and said, God save Benedict Arnold. The other reason I chose that title was that I think the best way to get at Benedict Arnold is to reserve judgment, allow, as I say, leave it to a higher power to judge him. Was he a good person, bad person? How did it weigh out in the scales? And just look at him as the facts of his life and what he was as a human being. I can't think of any particular sources that were particularly illuminating. There's been a lot of good biographies of Benedict Arnold written. My book is not really a biography, it's more of a military storytelling. But since the 1990s, there's been a much more balanced view of Arnold in the biographies that have come out of giving him credit where he deserved it and detailing his flaws where he deserved that. So.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.